Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill, a biofuels journalist now retired from full-time work, but still writing about ethanol and other biofuels for Ethanol Producer Magazine and others. There are so many good stories out there about the early days of the ethanol movement that ought to be recorded before they're lost. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people, and people love telling their story. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to BBI International and Ethanol Producer Magazine for producing this podcast. Our guest today is Doug Durante, Executive Director of the Clean Fuels Development Coalition. Doug has been an ethanol champion for decades, beginning in the late 1970s as a congressional staffer. Doug, welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast. How'd you get your start in ethanol?
Well, thanks, Sue. I always say this. I feel like I was really lucky. I'm not a city boy, but I'm also not from the Midwest. So I really had no background in this. But when you work on the Hill, and I was a staffer for a Republican congressman from Pennsylvania, Bud Schuster. But when you work on the Hill, you kind of do whatever they tell you to do. And fortunately, he was a transportation expert. He was very involved in the transportation committee. And at the time, we were studying various transportation policies. But of course, you have to have energy to power the transportation system. So I had been sort of put off in a corner and told to read up on this new alcohol fuel interest that had been really emerging. This was in 77, 78, but we had already had one oil embargo in 73. So there was a real growing interest to look at alternatives. So I was kind of, like I said, put in a corner and say, do a lot of research on this. About that time, the second oil embargo hit, and Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana came and said, we need to put together a commission and just focus just on this. What can we do with alcohol fuels, both ethanol and methanol? And we want to put a commission together that's really got unlike a committee on the Hill, this would have a very specific and very finite mission to identify the opportunities and make recommendations. So he was looking around the Hill for people who might know about this, and he went to Schuster, who had a similar commission set up, and he said, A, I want to structure this thing the way you've structured it with members of both the House and Senate, but secondly, do you have any people who know anything about this? And they said, yeah, the kid in the corner here has been reading up on it. So I was fortunate and got hired for that commission, and that was really, threw me into the fire. It was during the 79 oil embargo of Iran and the hostage crisis and all kinds of things, and the interest in ethanol and alcohol fuels just really was exploding. So it was a really good time for me as a young guy to be, starting in that and get exposed to that and quickly develop some expertise. So that was my background in that.
So at that time, there was both this concern about energy security, and then there was a big concern. Wasn't Birch Bayh's main interest because there was a big corn crop and corn prices were low? So you had this energy on the farm side?
Well, that's exactly right. So again, this is 79, 80 in that era. He was concerned because we had an 8 billion bushel corn crop, and it looked like it was creeping up. Well, of course, we have 15 billion now, so there was surplus at that point, and there was a lot of problems in the ag community in terms of cost of production and covering your costs. So we were looking for other markets. So you take those two things together: energy security and the need to find new outlets for ag products, and it really made ethanol, look very attractive. So that was what spurred it. But it is funny to think now 8 billion bushels would be really nothing in today's market.
So out of that work came what they called VTEC, the volumetric ethanol excise tax credit. Didn't that come out of that same era?
Well, it did, and so we know that the real issue it's been the overarching issue from day one and continues to be today is really opposition by a lot of the oil companies, not all of them, but an awful lot of them. So to entice them to take the product, and a tax credit was established, and it was effectively a blender tax credit. The person who blended the ethanol got a tax break on the cost of their fuel, and it was an enticement to get them to buy the product, and it worked. And unfortunately, the ethanol producers and the ag community got saddled with that and had to bear that cross that they were subsidized. But in fact, it was a blender tax. It was a tax credit that went to the person who put it into the gasoline. But in terms of doing its job and moving this along and getting it into the fuel system, it was very effective. But at the same time, you're selling to your competitors. So that made it sort of interesting because, you're competing for market share with gasoline and with the oil industry and asking them to take your product, which pushed some of their product out. So it was kind of a love-hate relationship. We had some oil companies that said, fine, we buy all kinds of stuff and we'll buy ethanol and use it for octane and extend our supplies. And others said, we don't want to have anything to do with it. But the tax exemption was a key part in getting things going.
And then that all disappeared in the Reagan area, did you say?
Well, and for me personally, after our commission was done, we made all these recommendations, and all these things we could be doing and continuing a tax break and providing loans and loan guarantees and everything. I went over to the Department of Energy, and there was the Department of Energy at the time had an Office of Alcohol Fuels, and its purpose was to be a support mechanism for ethanol. And again, it was much more ethanol than methanol at the time, but there was a great deal of interest in methanol as well, from natural gas and from bio-waste. And so, they were both kind of on the table. But so, yeah, we were at DOE. And then when the Reagan administration came in, they just were not interested in this. And it was all about budget cutting. And so that Office of Alcohol Fuels really got kind of neutered. And that slowed things up quite a bit during the 80s. So we had... and it was a real grassroots thing, and to the extent that there was success in the bit. I mean, just think about, back in 1980, there was 175, 200 million gallons. Million. We have 15 billion now. So it just shows you the phenomenal growth. But that's how tiny it was. It was a tiny, tiny industry. So it needed all the help it could get to get going. So for DOE to sort of turn its back on it, even USDA was, there were some real skeptics in USDA. So yeah, that was a real flat period, Sue, during the early and mid 80s. There just wasn't a lot happening, and yet the energy security element of this had not gone away. We were importing more oil than ever. So yeah, it was kind of a weird time during that period.
So was that when you started the Clean Fuels Development Coalition? Well,
it was a little bit later in the 80s. During that sort of mid 80s part, and by the way, there was in order to get a foothold in the industry, the Renewable Fuels Association was formed. And a guy that I worked with then and have worked with for the last 40 plus years, Dave Hallberg, worked for Berkeley Bedell, a congressman from Iowa. And Dave had the foresight to say, look, if we're going to get anywhere, we need to be represented. So he actually formed the Renewable Fuels Association. Did it and on his own time and often on his own dime. I worked with him and again, sometimes unpaid during that period. So he got that going. He got a foothold in Washington in terms of representation. But again, then it sort of flattened out. And it's important to, again, there was a dozen ethanol producers. I mean, it's tiny, and some of them were 1 million gallons a year on farm things. So, again, the interest from the oil embargoes was one thing, but it sort of petered out. So in that middle period, towards the late 80s, there were a lot of pollution problems around the country. And one of the things about ethanol that it's really important to understand, ethanol is essentially a liquid oxygen. Its chemical properties, it's got an oxygen content in it. And that's hard for people to understand. But if you can think of a soda and the bubbles in it, I mean, that's the oxygen part of what's in these alcohols. And what that does is it explodes when it's combusted and increases the combustion and therefore reduces particulates coming out of the tailpipe. So carbon monoxide was a real problem in some of the Western cities in particular. The Western cities with high elevation, often surrounded by mountains, Denver, Phoenix, Albuquerque, places like that, they all had this same problem. And somewhere along the line, the Congress recognized that one of the ways you can deal with carbon monoxide is to increase the combustion of the fuel. And the way you do that is with these oxygenates. So when we saw that coming, that's when we said, okay, how do we get out of this flat period? I was still working with some companies, but again, not much happening. And that's when we did form the Clean Fuels Development Coalition and said, even though the Renewable Fuels Association was there, they were doing their job to represent producers. I wanted to go at this in a broader context and try to understand why we weren't growing. And we weren't growing because oil companies were against us and automakers were sort of neutral and certainly weren't for us. So we worked to get both of them. There were a lot of positive oil companies at the time. Sunoco, Texaco, some of these guys actually had their own ethanol plants or interest in ethanol plants. And then the automakers, we sat down with them and said, look, all you got to do is put this stuff in your gasoline and you're going to get these reductions. And they figured that out. And so they signed on with us. So we went at this a little bit broader, than just representing the interest of producers. We had producers, but we tried to really get smarter on environmental issues and the environmental benefits of that. So that was how we put our group together.
Okay. So then you did a lot of work on the Clean Air Act?
Yeah, the Clean Air Act, that was the turning point in my view. It really was. I mean, again, all these local efforts and states were out doing their own thing. And sometimes it confused people. Iowa might be doing one thing and Nebraska something else and, blending at different levels. And even these Western cities I mentioned, the Denver and Phoenix, Denver said, gee, let's go ahead and use as much ethanol as we can. And by the way, carbon monoxide, this is very important. And I'll tell you in a second why it's important, but carbon monoxide is a wintertime program. And the cold air traps the carbon monoxide. And so the oxygenates are much more effective. And so they're out of compliance for federal standards during the winter, but generally that goes away during the summer. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But they all had sort of different levels. Some said, well, we use a little bit of ethanol, some said we use more. And we realized that if you're going to really grow the industry and really make things go forward, you can't be seasonal. So some of these areas were buying ethanol and blending it during the winter. And then as soon as that non-compliance period was over, they'd stop buying it. Well, that's pretty hard to grow an industry if you only have, half the year, or part of the year you can sell your product. So as we worked on the Clean Air Act, they were adopting these programs for the wintertime, but we said, well, wait a minute, if it works during the winter, it's going to work all year round. And carbon monoxide it's not just a winter program, it's a precursor to ozone. And ozone was the big, the bigger problem in the big cities. In every big city you can think of, New York, LA, Chicago. So we successfully made the case that there's no reason to stop in the wintertime. And that was the key to that was the first real big step for ethanol, was to be able to be used year round. That was the Clean Air Act. Some of our real heroes in that, Tom Daschle, senator from South Dakota, teamed with Bob Dole, back when you could do things in a bipartisan manner that we don't see much today. But those two got together, and it was the Daschle-Dole Amendment, and they created this basically year-round oxygen standard, and ethanol was boom. Now you go try to get a plant financed, and you can show that your market you can actually make your payments all year, not part of the year. So the Clean Air Act was absolutely, Title II of the Clean Air Act, mobile source provisions, just opened the door, and we saw a real increase in production from that.
Yeah, and that's the era when the Reed vapor pressure issue came up as well?
Well, Reed vapor pressure has always been an issue. Ethanol, for all of its great points, it raises octane, and it's an oxygenate, it reduces combustion. And the one thing it does oddly is when you add it to gasoline, it increases the vapor pressure. Vapor pressure, I think anybody listening to this can picture on a real hot day, sometimes you're filling your tank, you actually see the vapors, in the air on a summer day. Well, those vapors, are part of this, the mix that makes up ozone pollution and smog. So EPA in particular had it in our view, an over fixation on controlling vapor pressure and ignoring the sort of more benefits we were getting from the tailpipe. But in order to use this product, there was a vapor pressure allowance. So not to get in the weeds here, but if gasoline, for example, is controlled at 8 pounds per square inch, ethanol blends are allowed to go to 9 and still count. So that's but a nuance of the law, the way that was put into effect for 10% blends, and that's only because at the time that's what we were using. It's 10% blends. No one ever envisioned going beyond 10%. To be honest with you, I mean, we were delighted to get 10% blends, because 10% gives you a couple points of octane, and it was sort of the right number. Automakers approved that. it was just sort of the right number. Today, we're fighting to go beyond that. And it's ironic that it's a quirk of science and chemistry, but the vapor pressure increase that I just described, the extra pound that comes with a blend of ethanol, peaks at 10%. And not only peaks, but starts coming back down when you go beyond that. So it's complete, it's insanity to interpret, the vapor pressure waiver as being restricted to 10%. But at any rate, that was always part of the formula of controlling pollution. So that was always a kind of a wild card, and you had to work around that.
You said the folks on the Senate on the Hill working on all this stuff were incredibly well educated on all this stuff. They understood it.
They really have. I often, not to be too nerdy here, but if someone were to go back and be so inclined to thumb through the congressional record back in March of '90, when this was all being debated, it is astounding. So some of the discussions by the members, and they talk about benzene. In gasoline, and how we need to replace that and reduce it. And one of the ways benzene and a whole bunch of benzene related derivatives that are all carcinogens, by the way. Benzene's a known carcinogen. And API, the petroleum industry, admits that there's really no safe threshold for benzene, yet it's in gasoline and its byproducts are in gasoline. But even back then, we knew that. Daschle, Dole, Durenberger from Minnesota, who was chairman of the Environment Committee, Tom Harkin from Iowa, all these guys. You go back and read, and they talk about what benzene does, with benzene emissions come out and form more benzene. These, I wish I, had some of those folks around us now, because some of these problems have not gone away, but they were incredibly well versed in this. And again, I give a lot of that credit to the staff. I mentioned Dave Hallberg, but there's Todd Sneller in Nebraska, a bunch of other guys that, worked with, and we really made it a point to understand this and help brief them. But they took it upon themselves to really learn these issues. So, there were some very tight and contentious provisions in the Clean Air Act that were debated individually on the floor, but this Daschle-Dole amendment was based on that knowledge, that they understood that if these oxygenates were used, it takes a bunch of bad stuff out of gasoline and improves emissions and protects public health, and we won. So that was a really interesting era. I'm not sure I could find people on the Hill right now who would understand fuel science, even remotely, to be honest with you. I just don't think they do.
So you've turned some of the stuff, some of your work or research you've done, particularly on the sort of, we might call it the dirty tricks of the oil industry, into a book, have you not? The book called Gasoline Gate?
Well, we have. And I worked with a longtime colleague of mine, a fellow by the name of Burl Haywood. And Burl and I, in various capacities, has worked with me and on the coalition, and he worked with a great company, a good friend of ours who's no longer with us, Fred Potter, at a company called Information Resources. And they were big ethanol advocates, and Burl worked there and then worked with me. And so, yeah, we had compiled all kinds of information over the years on really one of the great disappointments of my life and my career, seeing what we could be and what we've not become, is due to not just obstruction by the oil industry, but by EPA. And every time, and by the way, the fact that this was in the Clean Air Act, a lot of people ask, they say, well, why is all this ethanol stuff regulated by EPA? It's an energy product. Well, yeah, it's an energy product, but it, as I described, it got its lifeblood, as an environmental tool. So every time EPA over the years has had an opportunity to help ethanol, or to view the glass as half full rather than half empty, it's been the other way around. It's been the most scrutinized and tested product in history. The burden of proof has always been on them. Californians, through the Clean Air Act, have their own modeling and never liked it, and EPA tended to side with them. And so, that story about the petroleum industry obstructing us and EPA sort of going along with it, and in some cases working with the oil companies and by fault or not obstructing us, we're kind of at 10%. You mentioned the 10% number. So Well, that's what we were when we started. I mean, it's preposterous that we can't go higher than that. So I do blame EPA. I do blame the oil industry, and we have documentation of why we would blame it. And there's just over the 30 years, there's been so many times where they could have helped us and could have gone a little bit further, and they did just the opposite. And when you have an oil industry that doesn't like any of this stuff to begin with, those two things together were a problem. So yeah, we had all of this stuff compiled, and we put it together in a book. And Gasoline Gate really tells that story, and including all the ethanol myths and all the things that ethanol had to had to answer for, and just how unfairly it was treated. And the book is in part a history of all of that. What happened at the states? I mentioned Denver, I mentioned Phoenix and Albuquerque. I mean, that was trench warfare. I was out there, and a lot of us were out there, fighting and making the case for ethanol. And many cases we won, but it shouldn't have been that hard, and EPA could have helped. So again, the book tells that story, but then the latter part of the book, we've gotten smarter as the years have gone on, and now we really understand the health impacts of some of these emissions, and they're way worse than we ever thought. It's particulates, and everybody knows, particulates, black smoke. You see it coming out of a smokestack, but a lot of this stuff is invisible because it's ultrafine, and these ultrafine particulates that are linked to gasoline, and we've known this. This is not like, we just nothing's been done about it. But the ones that are linked to gasoline are so fine that they bypass the lungs, can go right into the bloodstream, linked to everything from neurological ailments to respiratory problems, and it's all there. We've just not really done anything about it. And now we're hearing all this stuff about wildfire smoke. Well, these are the same kind of particulates, and everybody's up in arms about that, but yet we've been hooked on gasoline all these years. So the book is out there. It tells that story, and I think anybody in the business would find it of interest. And we're still continuing to try to talk to people in the medical community, some of the groups like the Autism Society and other groups like that to really get a little more serious about taking a look at this and demanding that some of this stuff be reduced, as they called for it in 1990. And EPA has never acted on that. They've never made a serious effort to get the benzene and the toxics. These are all under a family of products called aromatics, and they are classified as air toxics. And it's been a token effort to remove them. And it's just very disappointing. And because I know we can do better.
Yeah, definitely. So you've also talked about how at one point you realized that the oxygen requirements actually were going to limit growth in the ethanol industry. Can you talk about what that was about?
Well, that's interesting too. And again, I don't want to get too weedy here, but there are two oxygenates. There's ethanol and methanol, and methanol is much more corrosive than ethanol, so it's better used when it's mixed with some other products from the refinery and turned into an ether. And that ether pretty much does the same thing, but it's limited in its volume because of its corrosive capabilities. And ethanol is a higher volume, so if you set the standard so high that only ethanol could meet it, then the MTBE, the methanol product, would be out of business. So they lowered the thing so that both could compete. So it was a lower oxygen standard. So we were having so much success with cities that had been in non-compliance of ozone standards. And by the way, we've wiped out the carbon monoxide problem. There's nobody in non-compliance of carbon monoxide anymore. Certainly cars have gotten better, but the fuel had a huge amount to do. The fuel had a tremendous amount. So we were right. And we were proven right, and the numbers don't lie. I mean, cities came back into compliance, and so this stuff worked. And reformulating gasoline worked, and so we knew it worked, and we said, okay, well, why don't we just reformulate the whole country, not just the polluted areas, but everybody. Everybody should benefit from clean air. You don't have to be in violation of the standards to get benefits from it. And so we sat down and pounded out the numbers, and so at the volumes that had been lowered to equalize it, it was basically 2% oxygen. That would have been five-ish% ethanol, as opposed to today's 10%. And we said, okay, well, it's lower than we'd like, but if you do the whole country, it must be good. Well, we ran the numbers and it wasn't. It would level off at somewhere in the 5 billion gallon range. So in some respects, our success, threatened to limit us. And we worked with Tom Daschle in particular, and I was in his office with his staff, with some of the guys I just mentioned, Hallberg and Sneller and several others. And we ran the numbers and said, we're going to flatten out. We're just, if that's all we have to do at 5%. But what if we, had a renewable content that allowed us to go higher, but was flexible enough that not everybody had to do it? And that literally gave birth to the renewable fuel standard. So that was what, morphed into today's RFS. And of course, that success story is well known. That was a rocket ship. So we were right on that. And at that point, too, we were going back and forth between environmental arguments, energy arguments, but the trump card on all this, not to having anything to do with Trump, was the economic impact of this. All of a sudden, we're building plants left and right. I mentioned in the early days, we had a dozen plants. We have over 200 now. We're putting up plants all over the country, and mostly in the Midwest, but creating jobs, creating tax flow, creating new schools, creating new roads, new hospitals, and all these things. And it, was a resurgence in the Midwest. It was critical to the ag industry to create, new demand. And so now you got a three-legged stool. You got energy, environment, and economic development. And so everything we saw there was right. And you're backing out of the soil, you're creating tax flow to the government. So every myth that, and in the meantime, the oil guys were, of course, really threatened now by it, but because the volumes were getting so big, but the benefits were undeniable. Like I said, everything from jobs to helping agriculture to tax flow to the government. It was very successful, and yet it was almost a disaster had we gone down a different road.
Wow. And that work, when you sat in that office and determined we'd be limited if we stick with just the auction side, it took 10 years to get the RFS actually passed?
No, the RFS was, I probably should be really specific on this. No, it was only 2 Congresses. And by the way, what made it interesting, is because of this reformulated gasoline that was the year-round recipe. At that time, MTBE, the methanol, started having its own problems. It was leaking out of tanks, and this ether chemical composition that it was effective in a lot of ways. It could be pipelined, a lot of what ethanol would do. But it had a terrible problem if it got out. It meshed with water, and it would get into water tables underground. And so it was a real problem, particularly in California. So MTBE was banned. We're on the road to being banned, and ethanol said, well, that's great. Now we do have the whole market. So it was just as that was happening that made us think about, okay, what if we do get this whole market and at a lower level? So, all these things led to another. But the thing that made this really, really interesting is it was the bipartisan issue by Senator Daschle and Dick Lugar from Indiana. And Dick Lugar, just one of the most revered and respected guys in Congress, just a great senator, and everybody liked him. He's really just a good guy. So when those two teamed up, and Lugar's expertise was energy security. He was a real energy security guy. That was kind of his thing. And so it made it hard to argue against that. So, we ran it up the flagpole the first Congress. It got kind of far, but this happens with big bills. Sometimes you got to bring it back to the next Congress, because every 2 years you're starting over again. So no, it passed in 2005, and within the first 2 years, I think the first target was 5 billion gallons. In the first 2 years, we hit 8 billion gallons. It was just so successful because, again, the key to this thing, you could go and get a plant financed. The technology to turn corn into ethanol wasn't anything new, but being able to show your banker that you could sell it was really important. So the first one was so successful. We couldn't build plants fast enough. And within 2 years, we extended it. In March of 2007, we brought it up again for an extension. In 2008, we passed the RFS2. So it was, it was a relatively, as legislation goes, it was a relatively quick process.
So looking back on your career, I mean, you've been in this since the late 70s. Is there something that stands out or some message that you'd like to make to the folks that are going to be carrying this torch onward?
I think there is. I think it's really important to this day to understand that the burden that ethanol has been faced with all these years have to answer to all these things that just were, myths about ethanol, whether it was net energy balance or using too much water or we need to do a better job, I think, as an industry to get out from ourselves and figure out a way to tell the story better. I've just always believed that within our own community, everybody seems to value ethanol and understand it, but somebody in Boston or, a city that's not in the, somewhere like that, they don't know anything about it. So I think that the next generation needs to do a better job in articulating the benefits. And those benefits are still the same. They're the same they were, 30 years ago. You've got to, you want to be strong on domestic energy. You want to have an economic development. You want to protect public health. But I think the public health thing has really kind of slipped beyond. And I think the climate change issue has obscured some of the other issues. Climate change is not the same as health. I mean, all during the debates, I often heard soon-to-be President Trump, when they'd ask him about climate change, he said, well, we're for clean air and clean water. Those are two different things. I mean, clean air is not climate change. Clean air is clean air. And, so I don't think we've done a very good job in really that's why we wrote the book, in articulating that. So I think that's part of it, is to say, look, we got a product. Ethanol's always been saddled with sort of the silver bullet, syndrome, and saying, gee, so you're gonna take us off oil. So you're gonna save the world. Well, no, don't lay that at our feet. We're not gonna save the world. And I think there's a role for electrics. I think there's a role for petroleum. And I think there's a way bigger role for ethanol. So, we tend to get buttonholed, and so I think the whole industry just needs to tell a better story. And I'll tell you right now, for the next generation who may listen to this, grew up thinking that the next, great step is E15. Well, sure, 15% is better than 10, but we can do way better than that. We can do 20, we can do 30%.
I've been told that E30, the difference in E30 between that and E10 is no greater than the difference between summer gasoline and winter gasoline, that the computers on our cars can handle that. Is that true?
Well, I think the computers can. There's some discussion on, I mentioned MTB, methanol being such a corrosive alcohol. Ethanol has a little bit of corrosive properties too. So there's some thought that there might need to be some parts of the engine that are hardened, what they call hardened, using stronger materials, maybe stainless steel somewhere where there might be rubber. But so I'm not saying that every car on the road, right now can do it. But yeah, that's basically true. And there's a lot of confusion when we talk about higher blends. We say, well, E15 or E85. Well, E85 is a totally different animal. That's a flex fuel vehicle that does have to have some modifications made to handle ethanol at that volume. I drove a General Motors GM vehicle for 10 years in Washington to help, promote. So, I'm very familiar with FFVs, but they do need to be sort of specially made. There's not a lot of differences, but there's some small things that need to be done. Whereas a regular vehicle, particularly new vehicles with very robust emission systems, can definitely handle that. So that's true. And so again, it's not to get too weedy again, but if you go back and think about what I said about 15%, 15% is the top of or 10% is the top of the bell curve. So as you come back down at 30%, it comes all the way back down. There's no vapor pressure increase at all. So there's no reason we couldn't be making all of our premium grades right now, the high octane grades, with 20, 25, 30% ethanol. The cars can handle it. the need is there. I came across something interesting a couple of weeks ago, just a DOE press release that made note of the fact that 50% of new cars coming out now require or are recommended for premium. Well, premium is expensive as hell. Premium's very expensive fuel. Ethanol could make a premium at a much lower cost. So a 30% blend would be a 91, 93, maybe even 95 octane. So you would have plenty of premium. You could sell premium at almost regular prices. So we got to stop, in my view, thinking that somehow E15 is the limit, and if you want to go higher than that, you got to go to a flex fuel vehicle, because that's simply not true. And if you look around the world, I just got back from speaking at a conference in Europe. There was somebody there from the Philippines. There was somebody there from India. Vietnam is using 20% blends. India is using 20% blends. Are they smarter than we are? I mean, of course not. And of course, Brazil is the North Star in all this. I mean, they use tremendous amounts of ethanol. And, they're looking at hybrids with 20, 30, 40% ethanol. So we got to think bigger. So that may be one answer to your question. Let's not be somehow think that, okay, we get to 15% and we're all set. We can do way better than that. We have plenty of corn. All these other technologies that use non-corn products could probably come online if they knew they could put the ethanol somewhere. Right now, there's no room at the end. I mean, there's nowhere else to put it. So, I mean, why should we export 2 billion gallons a year, export to other countries when we can be using it here? And I guarantee you the economics are better if you're not paying export prices. So that's really, I think where we need to go. There's no technical, legal, environmental reason at all to not do this, and yet we're not doing it. And to some extent, I think it's our own fault. We're not reaching enough, and we reached enough with clean air. When that leveled off, we reached higher for the RFS. That's leveling off. The oil guys are still fighting provisions of the RFS. There's small refinery waivers out there. There's all kinds of people chipping away at it. Whereas if we just had a free and open market to blend as much ethanol as we want, it could just take off. So I think we're sort of not looking down the right road, and there's other opportunities, aviation fuel, other things. But every problem that we don't have to put ethanol in gasoline, we do have with these new markets. They need tax incentives. We're not sure of the role of them. There's just a bunch of unknowns. So I really like to see this next wave and this next effort, take us to a whole new level like we have historically.
You give this nice picture of the development, and like you say, you get in the weeds, but you describe the weeds very well for somebody who's not a technical person like me. Thank you, Doug. I appreciate you taking the time. And that book, if anybody's interested in taking a look at it, it's Gasoline Gate. Doug Durante is one of the authors, along with, is it Burl Haywood?
Burl Haywood, yes. And
all right.
Burl gets the credit for having the courage to take, this boxes of stuff we had to Georgetown University and sitting down with their book writing people and say, do we have something here? And they said, yes. So we put it together, and but yeah, it's available on Amazon. It's available, just Google Gasoline Gate. And but it's great interviews with people, a lot of history. And maybe next time around we'll talk about some of the specifics of that. We tell the stories in there about what the oil guys did to keep us from getting into some of these markets. And
it's pretty amazing. I've heard a few of those stories, but not all of them. Thanks again, Doug. I appreciate it. Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels@bbinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarsky, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.